Good evening. My name is Gloria Marini from the Piccionaia, and behind me, you don't see our usual wall with the pictures of our theatrical plays. I am in Rome right now, not in Vicenza, because today we closed one of our projects in Rome for the Italian version of Jitney by August Wilson. It was produced in our crew rehearsal had their rehearsals, and it was held in Trastevere in Rome. And this morning we had the chance to present to a small group of theatrical professionals and also researchers this interim phase of this work, especially the first part of Jitney. And it was a precious event as it allowed us to receive precious feedback and to gain some food for thoughts on matters that inevitably are connected to this staging, which is also part of the topics that we will be discussing today and over our fourth topic in 2 weeks. We talked about how August Wilson has been a great author, how difficult it was to translate this play from English into Italian. We also talked about how important culture wise it is to present such play on Italian stages, and it will be staged by Afro-descendant Italian actors. We also talked about the spaces and the space for debate that such play can open up in the Italian context to allow for social and cultural progress here in Italy. And these are just a few things that we are actually talking about. It was an intense morning, I have to say, and a very intense evening is waiting in front of us. Today, we will be talking about the language and race relationship. So, racism between language and discrimination. And obviously, will be approached this issue will be approached by two perspectives: the English one, the American one, the Italian one. So once again, I want to thank the U.S. Consulate General of Milan, which is supporting the Wilson Project, the University of Padua, the Department of Language and Literature, the University of Pittsburgh, the August Wilson Legacy LLC, and to get right to the core of tonight's meeting, I'm presenting you Susanna Ozu, who will be our moderator for tonight. Susanna is a diaspora and migration expert, especially in communication. She is the communication manager for Questa Roma Association in Rome, fostering issues and covering issues such as innovation, diversity, inclusion, which is based in Rome. It is an association that wants to remove any kind of discrimination through art and creative activities, and can capitalize on the effort and the action of people from many backgrounds. So I will now leave the floor to Susanna. Thank you, Gloria, for this introduction. I'm so honored to be moderating this panel, which I'm sure will be rich in food for thoughts for everyone. And as we already said, we're talking about language and discrimination. And so these are the two main issues we'll be focusing on. And we will draw an outlook on the situation in Italy and in the US. So thank you for your time and for being here. I know that it's not an issue that should be taken for granted, and I'm sure that some reflections that we'll be doing for Italy will be the same that we could say for the United States. But again, we will get into into detail of these issues. So, and I'm very happy for the panel that we have tonight, and I'm so proud and grateful for the job, for the work that everyone is doing for the staging of Jitney. So tonight we will be touching the issue of race on a 360 view and perspective, and we will see how this issue pops up in Italy and in the US. The webinar will be in Italian and English, so I will ask our panelists to interact with each other. Raise your hand, ask questions, but please do not overlap yourself when speaking so that it will be smooth. And sure you will have time to answer and to provide your point of view. This webinar will be registered and will be available on platforms. Tonight we have with us Anna Scacchi, Ngofeen Mputubwele, and Mackda Tesfaù, experts, professionals, journalists, PhD students, professors. So we have the creme de la creme who will shed some light on the topic. So without further ado, you will have approximately 10 to 15 minutes each one of you, but there will be plenty of time to go more into detail. So our first panelist today is Anna Scacchi, who gained her Ph.D. in American Studies. Anna Scacchi, that gained her Ph.D. in American Studies at the University of Sapienza of Rome. She is a professor of Anglo-American languages and literatures. She studies a Spanish language in the United States, women literature between the 19th and early 20th century, and racial representation in the US and Caribbean literatures. She's the author of many publications, which I invite you to read, and tonight you are the first speakers. The first speaker. Thank you, Susanna. Paradoxically, I am here as an Italian speaking probably more about the US, even though it will be challenging as I have here next to me Ngofeen that probably is more entitled to talk about the US than I am. So we'll be comparing our perspectives, and I'd like to start off with some aspects on which you can find things in common and also not so in common between the US and Italy. And then Ngofeen, I'm sure, will say something more and with another approach and perspective. So I'd like to start off at first basing myself on my personal perspective. When I started working on these issues, my colleagues and I approached this project and we found some resistance because right up from the beginning, we had clear the title of this collection of essays about race. And talking about race seemed to us a very difficult thing. It was more than 10 years ago, it was 2012, even though then it took some more time. We tried to file a proposal at a Congress, and but it was not really successful. So we asked ourselves, why is it so difficult to talk about race in Italy? In that case, we was very academic oriented, and we found a resistance, as Mackda reminded me a few days ago when we talked. It was a congress with anthropologists, but also with American scholars. Some of them took a very sharp position on the use of the word race, because in their opinion, keeping on using this word could do more damage than good, and it was not really in line with the biological content of of the word, whereas the sciences were moving towards another direction. We we came from an American background of in a critic world, and it sounded odd to us that every time anyone wanted to say the word race, it was to be put into um, quotations, because we didn't use it in a way to discriminate people. It was functional to talk about some historical events, and it was not related to the way that this concept was used up to World War II. So after World War II, the word race became a taboo concept, but it didn't disappear. It became almost invisible, and it was replaced by other concepts that theoretically don't talk about biology, but of culture, but that actually are used to hide the word race and discriminating um, meaning. When we think of cultural differences, such as differences that cannot be overtaken, and when we hear of differences that cannot be reconciled between the Eastern world and the rest, but so when we're not talking about dynamical aspects, so a fixed concept that is not a concept that is not biological. So I do believe to use the concept of race, keeping it clear and having it clear of what is its meaning. Many before me over the last decades who talked about Italian colonialism put it, it is important when, for example, it comes to shed light on how this concept interacted on the evolution and the development of Italy throughout the last decades. Obviously, there are some differences that we need to know to fight racism. And obviously, speaking of race, is still very difficult nowadays, even though right now it's more accepted, because it is needed to fight racism as a tool to fight racism. But I see that in society in general, outside the academical spheres, I find reluctant people to use this word. I know that when I was researching the issues for an article for a paper I was writing, I found some far right websites in which they put that races don't exist. And so that was not uh, usual. But then I read that immigrants should be deported back to the country they are from, even though they are born here in Italy from migrant parents. So using the idea of cultural identity, so they hit between cultural identity, the concept, the most wrong concept of race. So globally, as Munilla Silva and Theogoljan put it, we went from a theological racism to a cultural racism, or as Silva said it, who put it, it is racism without racists. And that's a whole other thing that I think is very present in the Italian context. The idea that there are many wrong ideas on racism, and one of them is one of the most damaging one, which is if there is not an intention, there is no racism. Racism is a violent act against individuals stemming from bias and prejudice and ignorance. And so if there is not the intention of hitting the other person, the speaker, as we're talking about language, the speaker is innocent, is relieved from any liability. So in this reasoning, I find two mistakes. One, so the thing that racism is a thing that involves the individual, whereas it involves the entire society, because it involves the entire society in the institution's laws, and it's not just single events. The second mistake I find is that if there is not an intention, we cannot talk about racism, whereas, and I learned that from the US, if a law or a provision or an action is racist or not, is not born in its intention, but in its effect. If a provision does not have a clear racist content, but its effects do, well, that provision or law is racist, notwithstanding its intentions. And the other thing I wanted to say is that this other approach that I find kind of common, especially when I'm in class, is that the difficulty in understanding the consequences and the everyday message that happens at word level, at small words level. We're not talking about swear words or slurs, but behaviors also that underline the discrimination and the idea of difference and inferiority, of pushing people below us compared to the average Italian citizen. This is often difficult to tackle with students, and that's my personal experience. And so that we, the white population, are not the ones in charge to say if something is producing damage, causing damage or not. For example, the blackface phenomenon. I've heard often to say that it's excessive, that it's it's an excess of politically correct. In Italy, it was done with a good intention to say I'm on your side to support, because often we white topics start from the presumption of being innocent. We believe ourselves to be innocent of racism because we suffered discrimination as migrants in the past. And this stems from also our ignorance, and our ignorance also on our own colonial history of racism, also in higher spheres, scientific racism, and so on. So I think I can stop here. One last thing is that very often we think that we don't have the proper words to talk about race. And that's, I believe, is a symptom of what I was saying. We have a lot of negative words. We have a lot of negative words that I use every day, and probably we're not even aware of that. For example, the cafe macchiatos or coffee with milk, the use of metaphors, or when you say to a black kid, "Oh, what a beautiful chocolate you are." So referring and linking black skin with chocolate, we have loads of this. What we need is a non-discriminatory language, non-discriminatory words, not to label people as inferior, but as to treat people just like us. And today at the reading of Jitney, I wanted to cite to quote the root from Faso, Lexicon of Democratic Racism, in which there are a list of positive or alleged positive words, and then the author talks about how racist they are. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. I loved your insight. I wrote down 3 pages of notes, and it has been very enlightening. I loved when you talked about how racism is not an individual thing, but it's systemical. I will ask I will ask you more later, because it's very difficult to convey people the fact that racism involves the society and not the single individual. It's I believe a broader concept. I'm very happy that you already said it in this very first part of the webinar. I love your thinking of the academic world, and to accept the concept of race that helps us to reason, to think, and to fight off racism. I really liked the when you mentioned the role of white people, and the last insight is the realm behind language, because sometimes I think that we do not have a language to talk about race and racism, but we have so many examples that probably we struggle with it. I know that sometimes I think of sometimes how the traditional media employed the wrong language, and when they kept on creating stereotypes. So that was a very important and very crucial uh, insight that you gave us. If I can say something more on a project that was born over these past years, for example, Pro- Project Champs, that via multimedia words were taken to describe these phenomena and that need to be used. Here I go back from translations. How often we found ourselves to translate terms from the English literature and struggling to find the same content in the Italian language. For example, blackness. It's very difficult to translate in Italian, and the word nerezza, I believe it's pretty empty in Italian, because translating words when they're not connected to the context don't really convey the same message. So thank you, Anna. We will hear you back in the second part of the webinar. Our second speaker panelist is Mackda, Ph.D. in social sciences. She obtained her title. She is a professor at Venice, University of Padua, New York University, Florence, and Stanford, Florence, and she collaborates with numerous associations. She is one of the co-authors for the Italian Post-Racial Archive and Memoria. I will now leave the floor to you. Thank you, Susanna, and thank you, Anna. I'd like to start off talking of an experience of an anti-racism action we had in 2020, and I will talk to you about language in broad sense, especially in schools. There's action we took in 2020 upon approximately at the end of March, especially March 21st. It's called Le parole che ci mancano, so the words we don't have. A group of activists, African descendants, researchers, so expert people, picked 7 words and created a brief definition of these words, also via short videos. They then partnered up with designers, graphic designers, to also provide a visual definition of these 7 concepts. Some of these words were not really words that we didn't have, but were words that we felt the urge to describe, and that in time we also learned to translate in a different way. Also, in the light of this difficulty that we may have when linking words with context. So the context of the South or the United States or the African American community. There was a first attempt when we wanted to talk about how to remedy the damage caused by colonialism and colonizations. But we wanted to go beyond that. Uh, we want to go beyond that with the word reparation. And in 2020, we decided to put this word as responsibility. But today I would say reparation, because the language evolves and develops. And most of all, it develops according to how familiar we are with certain uh, words and according to the behaviors that we adopt every day. This is to mention them. These 7 words are responsibility, as reparation, whiteness, decoloniality, intersectionality, colorblindness, that it's hardly ever translated, because even though it's very common in Italy, the literal translation into Italian would not suffice. I think I'm missing the others, but I will gladly share the link with you. So we decided to go on with this project because the language is the key aspect, because it's like the mirror for society, and because it shapes the society. It is a tool. Obviously, it's not in it's not tackled with the perspective to be addressed as a person that studies the language would do. It was more sociologic. But it was crucial, because if I don't understand the context and the problem, then I wouldn't understand the phenomenon, and then I wouldn't be able to fight this problem. And again, thus, I wouldn't be able to think of alternatives and solutions. So language became a crucial battlefield for us, and by us, I mean activists, or, or the so-called second generation activists, or naturalized people here in Italy. And when I say that, I'm also a bit embarrassed, shy, because I know that the words on which we talk the most become obsolete in a short time. I fought a lot to introduce the idea and talking about us as racialized people. But I realize that this word, but I find that this word does not really convey the message, because when you say that the person is racialized, you're actually describing that person for what the person suffers, not really for what that person is. So marginalized, excluded, and exposed to violence. So there are some core issues that are connected to the way we speak. Anna mentioned the difficulty in using the word race, which is one of the stronger symptoms to say that when the society is not listening, is not paying attention, then there is like a wall. You cannot communicate. And I am convinced that it is crucial to talk about race when the book Parlare di razza, or talking of race. I was a student, and it was a crucial moment for me. The moment when I entered into contact with certain uh, topics. Talking of race to me is crucial because it's a way to reconnect histories, stories, and fights. And if we don't do that, we cannot have a dialogue with other generations and with other people who, before us, fought against racism. But race is not the only problem, but it's simply the broader taboo concept that hides a lot of contradictions. When during the week of anti-racism, I saw children struggling the most with, and in line with the projects that we hold, was whiteness. A strong rejection also from was I found this rejection also from young white people. White is offensive. White is not offensive. Sorry, probably have some Wi-Fi problems. White is not offensive. White is a word that hides privilege, and privilege is hard to be talked about, and sometimes inhibits thinking that there are other people around us with less privilege. And again, there are words that are not prohibited. There are some prohibited words, but there are words that that still convey the same meanings without the speaker feeling accused of something. For example, ethnicity. When we hear the word ethnicity instead of race, in that operation, which is wrongful, I am naturalizing race, and is what history and that's what history and the scientific community tell us. Well, ethnicity also takes another meaning. So we can talk again about cultural racism with biological traits using other words and feeling safe. And then there are words that are abundant in our everyday language. Um, Susanna mentioned the project champs, but for example, keeping on saying of color instead of black is interesting because again with this approach to look at language, because it shows that there is we are missing the chance to see at blackness as something positive. So when we say of color, okay, what color? I would like to conclude by saying this last thing. I teach at Italian universities, but also English universities. So translation problems are real problems, but offer spaces for confrontation, which I believe are crucial, which produce in both direction changes. There are, for example, we talked about people of color, which is very much used in English, and which is present also in Italian. But if we want to use that, we also need to understand what does whiteness mean, because whiteness is not a race. Races don't exist. Whiteness is access to privilege, but probably this access to privilege is not given to whiteness itself. So what I say to my American students is that in Italy, being white does not is not enough. You also need your citizenship to feel safe and to be privileged. So inside classrooms, it's probably better to talk about uh, more powerful situations without putting color at the center of the debate, as it color does not sums up all experiences. And this is my speech for now. Thank you for this insight. You have been great at respecting, time slots. Again, here, many insights and food for thoughts, starting from the words we don't have. I loved your reasoning and your thinking on reparation, or when we're talking about blackness, trying to give the same historical power to everyone. So I'm very happy that you mentioned that, and thank you for your work. I can't wait for you to share the links. Also, I found pretty interesting when you mentioned the concept of whiteness. I also have questions. I will ask them later. And it made me feel that in the history of white people, when the book starts at the very beginning, it reads that when we talk about the concept of race, we always speak starting from other races, and hardly ever we start by analyzing what it means to be white in a society, and therefore to analyze the concept of race starting from white people and the privileged position that normally white people have and hold. Because I believe that there is this difficulty in talking about whiteness and privilege, because people don't want other o- other people to feel not at ease. But probably we will talk about it later in this meeting. Another interesting aspect is the experiment. When you mention people of color, for example, when I hear it, I get shivers, because I don't know if the person in front of me is putting context to that term. So I always wonder, and I am already asking you a question that you may answer later. Do we really need in Italy this translation work in Italy. So do we really need an exact translation for this term, or there is the problem that we may mix things up here in Italy? Because I'm afraid that maybe we could strengthen up the wrong conception, the wrong concept about of color. So I don't see right now if probably in 20 years this world will mean the same as it means in other literature, or it will be just as it is employed now, simply to talk about Black people. So that's the question for you. Also, I have a question on activism and schools, but I will ask all my questions later on. So right now, I will leave the floor to Ngofeen, journalist, essayist, and radio producer. He is one of the authors of the Radio Hours for the New Yorkers. He gained his degree in law, and then he got his master's in international development. He's also author of the podcast Duolingo French, and also worked with Gimlet Media and Stitcher, that works to allow people to understand other people's. He also manages other um, issues with an eye on international matters and Black diaspora. His job was put into the list of best 10 podcasts by the New York Times and the 50 best podcasts of 2018-2019 in Atlantic, and he was nominated for a prize. He also narrated and produced Black Italians Fight to be Italian. So we're again once more comparing Italy and United States. I'm very happy that you are with us tonight. We met some years ago in Rome, so I will now leave you the floor. Again, your contribution will be in English.
I'm the oddball here since I'm the American, but hopefully I can add something to the conversation. I'll try to keep my part brief because I think a lot of the interesting stuff comes from the comparison and the contrast of our two different conversations about race. I think for me, you get a little picture into my experience with race just from my name. Ngofeen Mputubwele. My parents are from Africa, from Congo. I was born in the United States. Because I'm born here, I live in New York City. Because I was born here, I am de facto an American citizen. I am an American. I'm a Black American. And then when I travel to Europe, in particular, into Italy, I am a Black person first. So my experience with race in Italy is sort of what shaped a lot of my thinking and interest in the topic. My experience with race, I have felt it consistently, is most concentrated in public transit, on the bus, on the train, etc. So when I go to Italy and I get onto a train, no one can see visually that I'm an American yet. They just see a Black person and with dark skin, and immediately I can feel the stares. Like people are staring at you. And it's like this very uncomfortable feeling. It feels a bit like being in the United States during segregation in the South, being a Black person in a white segregated space. So you feel this in public spaces, but especially in public transit. The kind of eye rolls and the kind of like, what is this person doing here? Especially because I'm not the only one. Often it's usually like me, and then maybe a few other people that I can intuit are probably migrants from Africa. So there's that initial experience. And then the next thing that happens is I open my mouth, and one way or another, you figure out that I'm American. Either I open my mouth or you see my passport. And in interacting with white Italians, what immediately happens is this immense switch. So we go from this kind of like, ugh, what is this person doing here? To this like, oh my gosh, wow, tell us about your life. So cool. And that was a bit of my introduction to race dynamics in Italy. Understanding that blackness is something that is negative and perceived as negative, so much so that talking about it is a bit convoluted, just even putting words to it. And then that American blackness, or British blackness, I think too, gives you like a different standing in the Italian context, because then you're associated with, you know, Anglo-Saxon land and you're cool. So that sort of relationship has been very interesting to me, and my sort of reporting and research has been around understanding the different ways that race work in the US and that race works in Italy and France in particular. One of the reasons I'm interested in these things is because I love culture. I'm a classically trained opera singer. So because of opera, you have to like study Italian. You have to study the European languages. You study Italian, you study German, you study Spanish, you study English, obviously, to be able to sing. I've also studied ballet for 8 years. And the reason I mention it is because I've been steeped in these very Eurocentric white art forms that are that we don't think about so much now, but as a person who loves history, I understand are fundamental to European culture, whether American or Western culture. And so it's very interesting to look at our cultural legacies and how they've shaped the way that we still behave now. And one of the most interesting things, I think, as an American watching the conversation about race in Italy, is that it's sometimes very odd, because sometimes it feels like, for instance, the needing to state that race is a social construct in the American context is sort of like, I don't need to do that. We all know that race is a social construct. No one means biological race. But it's also, in the US, it's like, it's sort of logical reasoning that like everyone knows that race isn't biological, but until, I don't know, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we all behaved that way. So when we wake up after World War II, that doesn't just suddenly go away. And so so it's like natural to talk about it. So it's interesting to watch the sort of like carefulness that has to happen in Italy to talk about it, particularly among white people. As has been mentioned before, the carefulness around talking about whiteness, which is similar to the US, but it's different. For a long time, I wanted to live in Italy or in France, but in Italy in particular. And in the last, 5 years, I have decided that it's not for me. And one of the big reasons is because the way that race happens in Italy is so, it's so strident, like it's so in your face, the discourse, the way that racism manifests itself. Whether it's people that are more conservative or whether it's people that perceive themselves as more progressive or liberal, the language, the jokes is just like, to an American ear, just like, wow, we are being really direct. And not direct in confronting things, but direct in just, blackface, thinking that blackface is okay, etc. And I think, I think that I am very fascinated by the role of culture and of language. And finally, I'm an attorney, a lawyer, the role of law in shaping the way that we talk about these things. A couple of folks have mentioned systemic racism, which, continues to be a conversation here. And as an attorney, and I studied in law school, and I also practiced as an attorney. I litigated in court, etc. And it's very evident for example, when you study constitutional law, that it wasn't just a bunch of people, individuals who were being racist in the 1850s in the time of the Civil War, 1860s. The laws of the state codified racism. And so it's always been systemic. It was systemic in the time of the Civil War. It's systemic now. And so I think keeping that in mind is like that sort of collision of law, culture, language, and then my personal experience has been sort of the way that I try to understand race in Italy. And that's it for now.
Grazie mille anche per questo.
Thank you for your intervention that added food for thought. A crucial notice is presenting and placing together two concepts, so citizenship and identity. When you mentioned your origin and your citizenship, because as you mentioned in your your trip to Europe and especially to Italy, you figured out how you were perceived. So first as a Black person, but now in Italy, this conception, probably preconception, changed immediately when you presented yourself as almost as an American. So as somebody not really connected to Africa. So this switch in people's behavior is absolutely interesting. And also here, in terms of activism, is something that has always been narrated but not understood. This sort, you mentioned it, cool. So if you're not African Black or Black, you're cool because you're American or because you are anything else. And in my opinion, that's very interesting because that's, I believe, something that every Black person lives when they travel on transportation media, because that is it's a situation that really puts you in utterly unease. So when you feel uncomfortable, when you feel an outsider from the environment you're in, you talked about whiteness, and also I will ask you a question on it because I'd like to understand how this topic is dealt with in the United States and in Italy. And I also enjoyed your example on how racism is clear, crystal clear in Italy, and how language underlines racism, and how this impacted, influenced your choice of life, in that case of where to live. So that is obviously something that Black people even in Italy go through very, very often, and how this racism also influenced people's life. I believe it was in 2021 when we heard of a suicide related to racism. These this uncomfortable feeling that people have. So once again, to underline that it's not the one episode or the one violent act that does it all, but it's the whole system that triggers problems. And the last point you mentioned is the one of regarding law, saying that these are not random phenomena. These phenomena have been systematized. So right now, I would ask you the questions I have. So starting from you, so you talked about how straightforward is language in Italy is blackface, the N-word, or I don't know if you've heard of recent cases of N-word or blackfaces in national TV, just to leave aside social media for a while. So these tools have been used multiple times for uh, very severe cases, and in Italy, and many people, white people in Italy, judged these events as non-racist. So they went by as a satire or innocent events. So nobody really assumed their responsibility for these events. So I'd like to understand from you, what's the reaction in the United States when publicly on television or elsewhere, uh, people hear the N-word or see the blackface? So what's the immediate reaction? And if you can explain, given your law background, also in terms of law, legal terms, these racist practice are fi-
that the US is a very racist place. There's lots of racism. So when I speak about the difference, it's not because we don't have it. We clearly, everyone knows that we have a problem. My dad, who is African, he's an American now, but he was born and raised in Congo. Growing up, used to say this thing that as an adult has stuck with me, which was that he would much rather be a black person in the United States than be a black person in France, where we have lots of family. In the US, when someone says the N-word, it's a game over, just like done. There's no conversation in a public space. There's no conversation about what your intention was. We're just done. We're done. There's no, and it's viewed as the most obvious example of racism. It's not subtle, so we don't have to have a conversation about it. It's sort of like everyone, whether you're conservative or liberal, will be like, you shouldn't say that. I think that, other things get slightly more nuanced. Blackface is still pretty bad, but you'll begin to hear debates where you won't hear them over the N-word. And I think generally that saying that my dad, I mentioned, is because of the idea that in the US, you have a very strong presence of like Black culture and a Black community. And so even though racism is experienced here, and even though racism is explicit, when it happens, particularly those instances that are very visual and very the individual type of actions, when it happens, people come to your aid to denounce it. You have a large part of the populace that will say, no, 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 large vocal, we have a Black congressional caucus. So in our Congress, we have a like a Black committee, essentially, like a subset. So it's not something that you have to be careful about. I think that my experience with Italy is that you don't sort of get that unanimous feeling that our conscience has been violated. You sort of have this parsing out of like, well, what did people mean? What was the context? That sort of discourse. I think that in the US, you asked about the law. I'm not sure what law specifically governs like the verbalization of the N-word. I'm sure that there's federal communications law around words you can't say. But really, I would say it's more in our legacy of our country legally. For us here in the United States, a bit of constitutional law, the country fundamentally as a legal entity changed after the Civil War. So we had one country before, And then legally, when the Civil War was over, a whole series of amendments passed. That the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which was equal protection, anti-discrimination, 15th Amendment, those were all passed, and they fundamentally changed our relationship with race and with discrimination, so that we have lots of frameworks that are articulated and exercised around racial discrimination, so that whether a law it could be discriminatory on its face, it could be discriminatory in its application, so it might be neutral on its face, but in the way it's applied, you could have a law that's discriminatory in its effects. And all of these are ways that our legal system has absorbed the notion that racial discrimination, since the 1850s is a taboo. I think that's how I would respond to that. It's definitely, it's not that it's not here and it's not present, but there's sort of like a big enough cultural presence and a body of law. And I'll say the last thing I find interesting with Italy is that, as a young person who is a musician, it's fascinating to me, the impact of Black culture in the United States is very obvious. The impact of Black culture Black American culture in Italy is extremely obvious to me, particularly in music. As an Italian lover who loves Italian opera, loves me some Verdi, love all Rossini, everyone, I love those people. But you look at young people, what do they listen to? They either listen to American music often, or even the music that Italians are making is just taking Black American music and putting Italian words to it, trap, etc. And so it's interesting to have this relationship where in Italy, and I think in Europe a lot, there's this love of American Blackness, but a rejection of Black people.
Grazie, hai perfettamente centrato il punto e grazie per la risposta e per averci situato.
And thank you for describing the N-word and blackface situation also in the US. And now we have more tools to keep talking about this thing also in Italy. And thank you for your reference on music. When you take inspiration from abroad, but you keep rejecting people. Over the last months, especially thanks to TikTok, I've seen a revolution of Afrobeats, even though I don't understand if the people that follow Afrobeats come from a place on earth that they sometimes reject. So thank you for your words. I'm going back to Anna, and I would ask Anna to talk about the role of white people in anti-racism. So what do you think can be the contribution of white people to tackle race and in fighting racism from a privileged position? And then if you want to add anything else, please feel free to. Well, I believe that, first of all, it is crucial to understand one's position of privilege. As Mackda said, many Italian teenagers and young people, for them, talking of their whiteness is almost offensive because they feel a sense of marginalization that cannot come into contact with the concept of privilege. Let's talk about how can people that struggle in finding a job, for example, be defined privileged in their opinion. So since when they think being white is capital. So it means being invisible. It means stepping on a bus and not being seen, or going into a shop and not be followed, or not, or for example, it means getting in an elevator and not feel uncomfortable. For example, many or some white girl could feel if in an elevator with a black man. So in order to be anti-racist, it means to do something practical against racism. And the first step, I believe, is acknowledging one's privilege and not getting mad or get frustrated, or when 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 the when the black person is telling you you are doing wrong, and that you are doing something racist. That is very hard to accept. But I believe that truly understand what systemic racism can help in this sense, to say how we are governed by structures that we're not aware of. For example, I tell an episode that happened to me because I believe it eases out inside the classroom to understand that we're not blaming on racism. We are learning how racism works. For example, when I was in the car and I was leaving the car to go to the airport, I had to take the shuttle from my hotel, uh, and I saw a person standing there, and I thought they were the driver. I had all the signals, if only I read them properly, and to understand that they were not African, but they were uh, from the Caribbeans. And immediately I saw that person who was an artist that was spending time there, and immediately in my mind, I placed them into a service position, as in the driver. So I don't know if Cabletown is. I simply needed to look at their hair, and that no one with that long dreadlocks could have worked as a driver for that hotel where I was. But I misread the situation based on stereotypes, and that helps to approach these issues, to see how often we act or react because we are trained to do so, to read certain situations. This training that dates back centuries, and for an Italian, it is a training that is strictly linked to our colonial past, and some of the words that we used, we don't realize how racist they are. And these words come from that period, that historical period. For example, the word "ambaradang" in Italian, we don't even know where it comes from, and we should be very aware of where this word comes from and to be aware of how to use this word. Another thing I wanted to mention is this tendency to think that the American approach to censure blackface or the N-word, etc., is to many Italians is an operation of being politically correct, because we know that blackface in the United States is done in private parties or in public occasions, or that the N-word is used a lot. But it is crucial that these words, these acts are censored on the public. Because I believe that sooner or later, these things will change the way we use words. It's not by chance that our thinking and our response to migration is influenced by the word invasion, of masses that are approaching the coast of Italy. And when we see the figures, they cannot live up to the expectations of these words, because there are 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. Because in Europe, we are one of the European countries receiving the less or the least amount of these people. Again, the hate speech in English, because hate speech, as Mackda said before, sometimes words, probably because we get used to it, or words that at first they sound weird, but with time they acquire a meaning that seems suitable. So there is an ongoing formation process for positive words, I would say. Susanna, you mentioned blackness. In this book that I wrote with colleagues, Fior di Pelle, we used bianchezza, so whiteness, and nerezza, so blackness. We talked about the latter a lot, and the editor required us not to use half English, half Italian words, but I explained that blackness and nerezza in Italian do not match in meanings. But probably in the future, I hope nerezza in Italian will have the same meaning as blackness. So words are important. If we in Italian keep talking about vucumpra, and there is no one saying that we shouldn't be using that because it's a slur, or if we keep translating Black English as the Italian a person that just arrived onto our coast would speak, we would probably keep thinking that Black Americans don't know how to speak proper English. So that's why I think that the project, the Wilson Project, actually talks to Italians and to Black Italians at the same time. And it may seem small, but I believe it's groundbreaking. Thank you, Anna, and thank you for answering my doubt I had on blackness and nerezza. I would now move on to the last question. Okay, so very last question. So my last question was for Mackda. Let's see if she reconnects.
I just think it's so true and so interesting to me. One of the examples that comes to mind for me is I was speaking with someone who is a therapist at some point, and they were saying that their job is to help people get the language to explain the things that are happening in their life. And the example I think of often is like if you're in a relationship with someone, and they yell at you, they call you names, they minimize you, they make you feel bad, you might for a while think, I don't love this, and but I don't know what I should do, you know. But through, for instance, therapy, if someone helps you take those things that are happening to you and put it into the word abuse, suddenly you're like, that is not something I want. Or I understand that's what's happening. And then it sort of gives you tools to change the situation or at least begin to conceive of what's happening as something not just odd, but serious. And I think it's the same way with any word, especially words like racism, race, etc. Is like finding the little box in the language that it's just a way to let our brains understand what's happening and then give us tools to change it. But if you take away the tool, if you take away the word abuse, it might be a lot harder to change the situation because you might not ever quite recognize what it is that's happening.
Grazie per questa precisazione, concordo. Non so se
I don't know if Mackda can come back in time. And I had a question on anti-racism in schools. I will ask either way, and one of you can answer. Regarding what Mackda said and her work as an academic person who also works in activism, anti-racism in schools, on the streets, with associations, I wanted to understand better how important is it to bring these narratives in real life. Because often I personally am present in both worlds, not really the academic world, because I'm not a researcher. It seems that Mackda can't come back. So I was saying, I am present, I'm active in both worlds, and I believe I see sort of an obstacle, a barrier between what is studied and what arrives into mainstream narratives. So my question is, how important is it to simplify the language revolving around race and racism to allow this language to reach everyday people, so people that are not in the academic world? So, for example, today I didn't ask you certain terms, but I know that if in the future we have to hold the same webinar in a school or in other environments, we probably would need to explain what racialization means. Today we went a bit smoother. So I believe the public should know already what the keywords mean. So how do you think we can translate this academic lingo for people that don't belong in the academic world? Any ideas? And the last question is people of color. How do you see this term in 20 years here in Italy? And that's it. And let's see if Mackda.
Academic realm to the mainstream realm. I think this is the part that I find extremely fascinating and exciting about Italy right now and race in Italy, is that to me, it's works of culture, by which I mean plays, essays, books, movies, Netflix shows, game shows. These are the means by which we as a public receive sort of what's happening. And so one of the things I find interesting and that I've written about is that, to me as an American in particular, so much of what's happening in Italy right now feels like Italy's version of the Harlem Renaissance, where you have so many different works of art being created, largely by the same generation of people. They're like within 10, 15 years of each other. And I don't think any one particular piece will change it, but it's sort of the way that these little shows, these movies seep into culture, and that's what sort of changes our language. Obviously, when I think about it, I think there are three ways to belong to a country, and they always they're in flux. One of them is that you're physically there. You belong because you're there. A second is that you're legally allowed to be there. A third is that you're culturally part of the national story. And I think that these things are always in relationship with each other. And I think that one of the ways that changes is for one, Black people and also white people to continue writing, making plays, art about Blackness, whiteness, all the othernesses. And I think things will happen too through mechanisms of law, through the way that legislation changes in Italy. But I think those things work together. And I think for the individual, I think particularly as an artist, I would be like, I'm writing a book right now, in my American context. Like, that's one of the ways I'm writing a memoir that will incorporate whiteness and Blackness and all those things. People will read that memoir and they'll get the language absorbs. So those are my thoughts on it.
Grazie mille. Anna, non so se vuoi aggiungere qualcosa.
Anything? Very briefly. Hoping that Mackda can come back because she's a truly expert on that. I agree with what Ngofeen said. Also, we would need to train teachers, not only when someone pays a visit to the school. Let's say, let's invite someone that will tell us where they come from, where a person goes there to explain their life and kids taste their food. This was wrong, but could be more acceptable 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but it is not right now. Right now, elementary school classrooms are full of kids from many different backgrounds and are Italians. So we need to change this behavior. And I believe that many of our teachers don't have the proper training to deal with a multicultural class. Books are crucial. Many years ago, I presented a project at my department. It was not funded, but it provided for the institution of prizes to spot, for example, points of contact between the 60s in the US. And when we realized that there were not kids' books that would make people reflect on what happened and that would talk about communities. So I thought that we could create prizes to see and to get to know Black new writers. I believe that would be important. Having a strong contribution on stories coming from other Italians, Italians that are not white, as Italians that are non-white Italians have always existed ever since the Renaissance, and they were considered more part of the society and the community than they are considered today. As it is person of color, I don't like it much, but not white people. I like it even worse. So you are a person on which a racial category has been imposed, but of color. Why of color? Aren't isn't white a color as well? Yes, this this is very true. So thank you for your words. So when we say of color, non-white, uh, and we speak of Italian history, it pops in my mind what an African Italian director said, who is Daphne da Cinto, who created Il Moro, who was Alexandro de' Medici, and the fact that in historical pictures he was portrayed as white when it was not. So recognizing the historical role of people with a non-white background had an impact on Italian and European history. So thank you. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you, Mackda, even though it's not present on our screen due to technical problems. Thank you, the panelists, for the food for thought that they provided us all with. And I thank you for your work, and thank you for fighting against racism. I want to thank the organization, and I will now defer to Gloria Marini. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ngofeen, and thank you, Mackda. I'm chatting with her right now, and she is fine. Sometimes it happens. It has been very important today. I believe we said crucial things, and I hope these messages will travel long distances and will reach many people. So thank you to the four of you. So this is the end of the third meeting. The fourth and last webinar will be held on Tuesday, April 18th, and the topic, the theme will be the spaces for African Italian voices in the field, in the Italian cultural field. We will talk about it in Gabashego, Ngofeen, and Valentina Repetti. So we will meet on April 18th. The Wilson Project will continue beyond the fourth meeting with the theatrical plays and with the movie projection. We will then move on to high schools with the workshop, and then we will reach May 12th with the presentation of the new play. So thank you once again. See you soon. Have a great evening.